So now that we've broken down this finished page, let's actually start coding the page. And the best way that I found is just to go through it section by section. So first we're going to code up the header. We're going to do that in this video, and then we're going to code this intro section, then the gallery, then the footer. So we go through it one by one. Okay, currently we're at this point. So if you've opened up, if you followed along until here, what we have in our index page is basically just the skeleton of our HTML. Again, remember we did this by hitting the exclamation mark and then pressing tab. And then we added our style sheet here so that it's linked to the style here. And we know that if we change the style here to green, for example, like this, we actually see the page change here. And that's because we have this live server thing running. So if you don't have that, again, what you can do is you can click this button here that says go live, and that will open the page up in our browser here. And then we have this live connection between what we type here in Visual Studio Code and what we see in Chrome. I'll go back to black here. And we're going to write some HTML code and then style it with CSS. So what I want you to take away with this is don't worry if you don't understand some of the code or most of the code, that's fine. Sort of look at it as taking a language bot in a foreign country, right? Where in the beginning, everything just sounds weird and foreign. You have no idea what people are talking about. But after a while, you start to distinguish patterns, connections. And so that's what I want you to take away from this as well. So it's sort of like a bath into HTML and CSS that we're doing. So with that in mind, let's get started. So we're going to start with a little bit of CSS, and we're going to start that by adding some basic styling to the body. So adding some basic declarations here. And I'm going to cheat a little bit by opening a new window off screen that you won't see. And then in that window, I'm going to make sure that I actually follow the thing that I put in the finished version. So again, if you can't follow, the finished version actually has all the code there. So if you miss something, then you can type that in. So we're going to use a color here, and the color is going to be hexadecimal value of 123. So I'm typing hashtag 123. And again, don't worry if this doesn't make sense. This actually corresponds to a color, but I'll explain later how that is or why that is. Now we're going to set a font. I actually want to use a font from Google Font, but right now I don't have that yet, so I'm just going to type sans serif, which is just the default font. So if I save that, that's going to probably this doesn't look the way that I want it to. Maybe I should type font family. Oh, there we go. So font family gives us this sans serif font. So it's a default font basically. And then we have a font size. We're going to be a bit bigger, 14 pixels. And then we're going to set the margin to 0. And you'll see that the elements sort of snap to the edge of the page here, which is not really nice, but it allows us to add some padding for each element individually in a moment. We're also going to do at the very top here, we're going to add two declarations that I almost always add to a page. And one of them doesn't make any sense at all, which is fine, which is box sizing border box. And again, we'll come to that later. And then also I'm going to set the image to a max width of 100%. We already covered this in the first lesson, but basically what this does is it makes images responsive. So they never grow bigger than the size of our browser window, which is very convenient if we're working with small screens like an iPhone, for example. Okay, and then we're also going to style what a paragraph will look like, even though we don't have many of them yet. So we're going to set a default margin of 0, which means that there's no space around that paragraph. So you see the paragraph, and which this one is sort of attaches immediately to the content here, which is sort of fine, but we also want to add a margin bottom of 1 rem. And again, I'll explain what these rems are later. And so you see that we have a little bit of spacing. Now, the inspector tools are super useful here. So I really advise you to have them open at all times so we can actually see what's going on. So if you hover over a paragraph, then you can actually see the margins highlighted below. So I have this blue thing in which is the content, and then below that you can see the margin. And so you see that the margin at the bottom is applied. So if we would do margin top, for example, or let's say margin left, for example, we see that we have margin to the left and to the bottom, right? Cool. So we don't want this one. And then also one default thing that I want to do is I want to make the colors the same color as the rest of the page. which we don't have yet. So then it's time for our header. We're going to make a header, and even though we haven't written the code yet, maybe let's write the code first. Yeah, so let's get rid of that and let's write the code here. So let's get rid of all of this stuff, and we're going to start with our header. So we type header tab. That completes our header tag, and inside of our header we have two elements. So going back to our original design, and this is probably, if you do it yourself, you probably have a design sketched out, or you've made it in Illustrator or whatever, so you can sort of go back and forth between that. But we can see we have two basic elements, right? We have our header here, and then we have these two links here. And that's the navigation of our site. So the first one is our header, or the name of the site. So I just called this portfolio, but you can name it, you can give it your name. So that's on one side, and then the other one has a nav element, which stands for navigation. And inside there, inside that nav element, we have two links, projects and contact. So to make a link, I'm going to write A, press tab. The href is where does the link point to, but at the moment we don't have a project page yet or a contact page. So we're just going to write this hashtag, which basically means, okay, this is a dummy link. It doesn't go anywhere. So clicking it doesn't have any effect. And then we're going to write projects. So this is where the link points to, and this is the actual text that's inside of the link. Do a second one. Again, hashtag for the destination of the link, which is nothing. And then we're going to write contact. Okay, let's go look. Okay, cool. So we have the word portfolio, we have projects and contact. As you can see, it appears below each other. Cool. Let's add some basic styling to this header thing. And to style this, we're actually going to use a layout system that's called Flexbox, and that's built into the browser. And here's a page, I'll link to it in the description, that explains what Flexbox is and does. And again, it's a huge explanation. Don't worry too much about it. Maybe we just have to think about the problem that we're trying to solve, right? By default, all the elements on the page, on any HTML page, always appear below each other, right? So the problem that we're trying to solve is, how do we make elements appear next to each other? And so to do that, we are going to use Flexbox. In Flexbox, we can define that elements should either appear in a row, so next to each other, or they should appear in a column, which means below each other, right? We can also define if they should appear at the beginning of the row or the end of the row, how they should be aligned, should they be centered or left or right, and if we have some extra room, like for example, we have some extra space, what happens with this extra space? So here in this case, this one gets squashed to the left and this one gets squashed to the right, right? That's what happens with the extra space. So another thing that we have to consider is that we're designing for mobile first. So we're actually making the mobile version first, which means that this default is actually quite okay, because we actually want them to appear next to each other on mobile. Again, if we make this small, you can see that we have the portfolio here and then we have these links here. You can also imagine that we are doing a hamburger menu so that you can click it and a menu appears, but we'll keep it simple for now. So if we're using Flexbox, our header is going to appear first as a column, and then only later, if our page becomes big enough, it's going to appear as a row. And so that's what I'm going to write now in CSS. First, let's make sure that we can actually see that it's working. So we're going to go to our CSS style, write header, and then here we're going to say, okay, the background also has a color. And I'm using these colors that I sort of picked or like, but it's up to you. If you want to use different colors, go ahead. So by writing this, what I actually am doing is I'm setting the background color. So you can see that this element now defines the background color. We have this weird empty margin here at the top. Don't worry about that one just yet. And then we're going to say, okay, now we want to use Flexbox, right? And here's an extra rule that I'm just going to type here just to show you. So if I just set the flex direction to row, actually now we can see that the elements appear next to each other. They appear really weirdly next to each other, but they do appear next to each other. We expect this one, these projects to appear here, but that's actually another rule that we're going to specify. And we also want them to like center, but all of these things we can fix in a minute. So we don't want this for our mobile layout. So for our mobile layout, the direction actually has to be column, right? So For the mobile layout, we're now done. But if we want to make our page work on desktop as well, we are going to specify what we do. And the best way that we can do it is using something called media queries. Basically, we ask, okay, how wide is a page? And so if the page has more than a specific width, then we're going to do something else. So again, we're doing mobile first. So we start with a small screen and grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So the way that that works is we're going to write add media, and then between brackets, we're going to write min width is 400 pixels. So if you squint, you can sort of read this, right? So we're going to look for a media, so a device basically, where the minimum width is 400 pixels. And then if that is the case, then everything that's inside here applies. So these things could be really weird things as well. So for example, you could say, well, if the minimum width of our page is 400 pixels, then the body background color changes to green. Very weird and strange, but it works. So if we now click this device toolbar and make it smaller, we see that we have our default background color. But if we make it bigger, then all of a sudden the background color changes, right? So clicking on this, you can see that we have our background color here. That's now strike true. So this one no longer applies. Instead, this one applies because now the media is more than 400 pixels wide. And so if you make it smaller, you see that that rule disappears because it no longer applies, right? Our page is too small. Now, we don't want to do this for the background. It's kind of silly. But here we want to say, well, the header, specifically the header, what we want to do is we want to change the flex direction from column to row. And so again, if we drag this, you can see that now the elements appear next to each other. If you make it smaller, then they don't. Again, we can click on this header thing to see which rules apply. So now we're small. If you make it bigger, then we see we have this extra rule, right? So it says flex direction rule. Cool. But of course, there's some extra stuff that we have to do. We have to say, well, what happens with the elements here? So we can say justify content. And what that means is basically if you have some extra space, put that space between the elements. Space between means, well, all the extra space actually appears between this element and this element, right? So you see that this one now moves all the way to the left and this one moves all the way to the right, and they stay and they stick there. Also note that by default, we don't have any margins here, which is fine, which is cool. That means that we can define them ourselves, right? So that's cool. We already made a page that works on mobile, especially for the header. The other things are just basic tweaking things that we have to do. So another thing that I would like to do here is align items. So justify content defines how they look like on this axis, this direction. Align items defines how they look on this other axis. So in this case, vertically. So basically we want them to center so that this one appears centered and this one appears centered. So there's also top, for example. So both elements appear at the top, or there's bottom. That which doesn't do anything. I think it's called flex end in this case. Okay, so flex end. And again, we just want to use center for now. So just use that one. And okay, so we're styling the header and then we're done, which means that we're going to say header h1. And note that I'm writing two things after each other here, right? And what that means is I want to style the h1 that's inside of the header, which in this case it is. So if I use an h1 somewhere else on the page, this rule won't apply, right? And so what are we going to write here? Well, first off, I don't want any margins around the header because it will look weird, and not sure if we can tell if we get rid of those. I think they will be fine, but this is just the default. So margin of 0. We're going to change the font size. We're going to make it a bit bigger. Maybe I'll put these ones side by side so you can see it a bit better, like this. So a font size of 30 pixels, so it's a bit bigger here. A line height of 50 pixels. This is actually what makes this thing have a bit more room here. And then because it's sort of squished on the left side, we also want to give it a padding to the left. So we have some extra room here. And then, so that styles our H1 element, right? So we have this little padding thing here. We have a little bit of space below and on top and below, which is this line height thing. And we don't have any margins. And we do the same for navigation. We add some rules here. So the first rule is also to set the line height to 50 pixels. And the reason why we do that is so that these elements, once they go wider, sort of nicely align. So they're really nicely in the center here. And then finally, what we're going to do is add padding right of 20 pixels here. And what that does is basically give us some space on this side. There's more rules that we can add if we want to. For example, we can do header, nav, and then A, so that styles our navigation, so our links that are inside of our navigation. For example, we can give each link itself also a little bit of padding, so they're a bit more spaced apart. And there's like text decoration, which means that our header, our links no longer are underlined. But maybe we want them to underline when we hover over them. So we write header nav A, colon, hover like this. And here we say text decoration underline. And this is a specific one where it says, okay, this is a normal link. This is if you hover over them. Now, if I hover over the links, and this doesn't work on mobile, so I have to, of course, there's no hovering on an iPhone, so this doesn't work here. But if I see the full page and I now hover over them, you can see that we actually hover over the links, right? Okay, so that's the end of the video. Make sure that you play around with the colors, the spacing, see what happens with the styles. Also try to change these things in the inspector and see if that if you get it working for you.